What brings you here today? What's led you to emerge from your set somewhere in the UK? What's led you to scuffle down to Parliament Square to stand up for a badger? I'll tell you what's led me here. A love for life, everything that creeps, crawls, slithers and slimes. An initial fascination to want to understand that life, how it works. Growing into a time when it became apparent to me that that life was being rapidly diminished and I'd have to actually do something to try and prevent that. But also to a massive pile of shit and a tiny piece of snot. Let me explain. In the early 1980s, I embarked upon a project looking at badgers in two parts of Hampshire, some lowland dairy farming and the New Forest. So every Sunday I would go out and I would collect 20 bags of badger poo, and I'd carry them home and I'd triple bag them to try and reduce the smell, and I would put them into my mother's freezer. She was overjoyed. And then every Thursday night I would take the badger poo out and I would take it to a lab at Southampton University, and whilst the rest of my peers were watching Top of the Pops, I would peer down a microscope and see what the badgers had been eating. And I could see quite clearly where they'd been foraging from the leaf litter. I counted the number of earthworm cheetae, those little hairs that earthworms have so that they can propel themselves forward. And I figured out that the reason that the badgers in the dairy area and the New Forest were living completely different social lives was shit. Because in the dairy area there were plenty of earthworms. We'd opened a badger supermarket, lots of improved short grassland where the badgers could go and access those worms easily, whereas on the acid soils of the New Forest, access to that primary food was restricted and they couldn't defend territories big enough because they didn't have enough shit to go round. And that's why I'm standing here today, because that little bit of science that was unknown at the time gave me an advantage in my academic career, and it allowed me to progress to the point that I was able to do the job that I do today. So that's the shit, the badger shit. And I loved collecting that. I loved going out and counting the badgers, just as Rachel's described, those moments of anticipation when you think you see one in the darkness, where you start to imagine badgers, frankly. You think a piece of bracken in the moonlight is a sow with her cubs, and then you wake up and it's not. They're enigmatic, they're charismatic, they're inaccessible to many people. They play a massive role in our culture. We're naturally drawn to them. It's true that all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others, and the badger is one of those. During lockdown, like Alice, I reconnected with the badgers. I was very fortunate to have a set on my doorstep, and I went up, I dug a hole in the ground on the edge of the set where I could lay flush with the ground, and I put out food for them, and I started photographing them. And on one occasion the cubs had become so accustomed to the fact that I was there that I was filming them on my mobile phone, and some of the peanuts that I put out were between my face and the phone that I was holding out. And one of the little cubs nudged under the phone and it brushed its nose against mine.
Wow.
A little piece of snot on my nose that wasn't mine. That connection with life, a life that you love so much, is what brings us from our sets to this square today. We mustn't forget that for all of the stats, for all of the science, our fuel when it comes to our motivation is that love for life. That's what brings us here today. But essentially, to make any argument, love is never enough. And we have the science, we have the stats. You've heard them from Rosie, you've heard them from Alice, you've heard them from Dominic. This cull will be a blight on my life and all conservationists of my generation and age. Because yes, Whilst we've been presiding over trying to protect the UK's wildlife, we've lost nearly 250,000 badgers. That guilt weighs heavily. As Dominic said, there are many of us here today who've got up pretty much every single day for that period of time and done something to try and protect these animals. But ultimately, up until this point, we have to admit that we've failed. They have killed 250,000 of them, despite the fact that that's been underpinned by astounding ignorance. Why is that then? Because if we understand why we failed up until this point, we might succeed in the future. Well, I postulate there are a number of reasons. Firstly, look at us. Look around you. Who do you see and who do you not see? Who's missing from this crowd? Who's missing from this crowd that purports to care about the UK's wildlife? Where are those people who we pay our subscriptions to and read the magazines? When it comes to it, they haven't been standing up as forthrightly as us. Why? Well, because they don't want to upset the farmers. You see, aside from the civil servants and aside from the politicians, it's not just them that don't want to upset the farmers, it's been the conservationists too. But the fact is, as Alice has so poignantly, pertinently and precisely pointed out, farming is in a mess. And our farmers need our support to get them out of that mess. And what's clear at the moment is that we are not running DEFRA. We all know who's running DEFRA. And we all know where that influence comes from and how powerful it is. It's not the NGOs, is it? We don't have that access because we don't have that funding, we don't have that long-term ingratiation and access to power. We don't want to make enemies of the farmers, but the cull has done everything within its power to do that. Not only has it been destructive in terms of killing badgers, it's been enormously divisive when it comes to conservation, not just of badgers, but of all of our wildlife. And that has been enormously detrimental. It scares people. They don't want to pick a fight. But unfortunately, we're in the last round. We're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. We've had 4 state of nature reports which are telling us quite clearly, with very good data, that our wildlife, our habitats, our landscapes are going rapidly to hell in a handcart. So we can carry on as we have been doing, paying our subscriptions, being nice, being timid, or we can finally summon the energy to take the fight that we need to. And at this point, given a new government that have made promises, it's time for us to hold their feet to the fire and demand that they keep them. Not acquiesce to a fob that they've made with that farming lobbying fraternity that are in there in DEFRA at this moment in time because they've got passes that sweep them straight in the door. They don't even queue. They've got their own access. It's time for us all to say boo to the NFU. Yes! Let's hear it. Boo to the NFU. Boo to the NFU, to the NFU.
All measures responsible. In 2001, there were 4,800 TB reactors in the herd on average a year. By 2003, there were 28,000, and it hasn't fallen, no matter the fact that you've killed 230,000 badgers, probably spent £100 million on the biggest wildlife destruction policy that any of us can remember. So enough is enough. Stop the killing. Stop the badger blame game. Hold the farming industry to account to change for the good of society and the environment and animal welfare. And let's leave our precious wildlife alone and value it for what it is. And we must keep standing up and we must keep fighting for it. Thank you very much.
The people at Born Free have been fantastic in their support of Badger Trust in the last few years.